So maybe you haven't noticed this, but lately there's been some negativity focused at landlords, particularly with the idea of a landlord ever raising the rent. You hear words like slumlord or leech. And those are some of the nicer terms that I've read. If you look at the comments at some of my videos that I have on this channel, you'll see that some people are just not nice to landlords. They have this negative opinion, and more often than not, they make the idea of charging rent some moral dilemma, as though a person who would ever consider charging rent or raising the rent an immoral person. We're talking all about that today. Let's get started. So we know that landlords are real people and they deal with real people on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes part of the landlording business involves the concept of profitability. And sometimes in order for a landlord to remain profitable, they have to raise rent. If costs go up, then the rent usually has to follow. And that doesn't make every landlord feel very good. In fact, many landlords feel quite guilty when the time comes to have to raise rent and then share that fact with their current tenants. Today we're going to review a video that I found on the topic. Some of you may know the Dave Ramsey show, and one of the things that they talk about from time to time is the issue of budgeting and rent and business. So on today's show, they're going to take a question from a landlord who's feeling this guilt when it's time to raise rent, but they don't know how to share that with their current tenant.
I'm a landlord who owns multiple rental properties. Over the past year or two, rent prices have seen a big increase. This is great for a landlord, but not so great for the tenant. I know I need to raise my rental rates to keep up with the increased overhead costs. However, this causes direct hardship to my tenants that have been good tenants for the past few years. As a Christian, this is hard for me. I would feel bad if raising rent caused them to have to move after they've made the house their home. I did not get into real estate to subsidize people's living expenses, but I also didn't get into real estate to displace families either. I love investing in real estate, so I don't see myself exiting this field, so I'd like to hear your advice on how to balance this equation.
Well, that's the big question, right? How do you continue to do this landlording business and then also care about the people who are residing on your residential property? I often tell landlords that short of family and one's own personal health, the place where they live is the most personal thing to them. And so if you're going to raise the rent, you have to take these real life elements into consideration. One other truth is that of all of the expenses that everybody has to contend with, their living expenses are among the biggest. We devote a significant portion of our income to the place where we live. Whether you're a landlord or a tenant, you're probably hyper aware of this fact, that your living expenses account for probably your greatest expenses in your monthly budget. So if you as a landlord know that your decision to raise rent is going to significantly impact the budget, the monthly cost of living for your tenant, that's a real consideration. How can you do that without paying at least some mind to it? And the final truth is, if you have to raise the rent and your tenant can't afford it, moving is itself a huge, impactful decision that they might have to make if it turns out they simply can't afford to continue living on your property. With all of this in mind, of course, a landlord is going to think, am I making an immoral decision by raising the rent if it means that my tenant would have to move? I know you're getting value out of today's video. If that's the case for you, please hit that like button. If you haven't considered subscribing yet, please subscribe to our channel. That's extremely helpful for us. If you have questions or comments, leave those below. I review those every single day.
Okay, I own rental property, single-family homes, among many other properties that we own. And if I raise my rent to be market rate, that does not make me a bad Christian. I did not displace the person out of that house if they can no longer afford it. The marketplace did. The economy did. The ratio of the income that they earn to their housing expense displaced them. I didn't cause any of that. And so you are not displacing them. You're taking too much credit for what's going on. If they need to move to a cheaper house because they can't afford, they're going to move to a lesser house. Because if they move, they're going to pay market rent.
And that's the whole thing. The issue is the market and what is fair on the market. Because you're a landlord, you are a participant in the market, just like the grocer, just like the clothing store, just like the car dealership. And so there's nothing unfair about participating in the open market. Now, this would be a totally different video if I was telling you to take advantage of people who otherwise can't afford things and to charge them something that is unfair for the thing that you are offering. But generally speaking, most landlords don't operate on this basis. Most landlords are going to offer their home, which has a certain market value, at a fair market price. In fact, in most cases, the fact is, if you're charging way more than your house is actually worth, you're not likely to get a new tenant to sign that lease agreement. And if you operate on this way, this isn't the place for you. I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking and offering advice to those landlords who are operating on a fair market spectrum. And so what I'm saying to you is, if you're already on that spectrum, if you're already offering a fair price, or if you have to raise your rent so that it meets that fair market value, there is no qualm about it. There shouldn't be. The fact is, if you have a home of a given value, and at this point, due to the rise in costs, you have to raise your rent to meet that fair market rate so that you remain profitable, there's nothing wrong with raising that rate to meet what the market now demands. Another issue that all business people have to contend with is the fact that what is fair on the market often fluctuates. No clearer example is that than the gas station. In fact, it's often that amount for a gallon of gasoline fluctuates so often that signs change, sometimes on a daily basis, to meet that market demand. Certainly that's not necessarily true of real estate, but it is true and obvious that property in this year is significantly more expensive than it was 30 years ago, than it was 60 years ago. The truth is that a fair rate for the same piece of land, the same kind of housing, often changes due to the way that the market fluctuates. We're having to deal with rising costs for insurance and materials for repairs and maintenance of property. Additionally, taxes, which have gone through the roof, have an immediate impact on what is necessary for a landlord to remain profitable. So if you're having to raise your rents in order to meet these market demands on you, the fact is, you may have to raise a rent on your tenant, but how do you do that in a way that is responsible?
I've had situations, because I manage the properties with a heart and a head, both. I don't personally manage them, but we do, my family does, that someone is sick. I remember one time, a long time ago, a lady had cancer. Am I going to evict someone in the middle of chemo? No, I'm not. I'm going to work with them. I'm going to be kind. I'm going to have clear conversations. I want to know what's really going on. I don't want to be duped by the situation. But on the other hand, I also want to treat other people like I'd want to be treated. That's a biblical mandate.
And that's sometimes where a landlord with a personal relationship, a connection to their tenant, can make a judgment call. If you've watched any of my other videos, you may have come across my 137 policy. And what this policy takes into account is the real lives of actual people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And the one functions as your one opportunity to make a judgment call for someone you know and trust, someone you've developed a relationship with, and maybe you cut them a break. Now, certainly you can't forgive all trespasses. You can't forgive all lease violations every single time they occur. That's bad business, but there may be that one situation where it makes perfect sense to extend a bit of mercy, a bit of understanding. Because the truth is that goodwill itself has value. Your goodwill that you earn from your tenant from this one time where you make a concession may in the long run end up establishing a good business relationship with someone you want to keep for a long term. Perhaps these tenants are the best tenants you've ever had. They take care of your property in a way that no other tenant has, or every single month they are otherwise on time with their rent, and this is the kind of situation you want to prolong. So in this situation, you may decide that while you have to raise the rent, you may do it in a way that over time accommodates the needs of the tenant, so that you're raising your rent to address the cost that you have to contend with, but also doing it in a way that takes your tenant and their present situation into account. And so you do it in a way hand in hand with your tenant that keeps a good person in place, but that also adjusts to your market reality. So you're using wisdom in conjunction with understanding. But that also takes the following into consideration. Is their need legitimate? And yeah, it's unfortunate that this question has to be asked, because we've got some real case examples of where tenants took advantage of landlords. In the very recent past, we know that due to the pandemic, there was an eviction moratorium put in place by the government. So this moratorium was imposed on all landlords. And the truth was, there were a lot of people who very much had need. But there were some who simply didn't have that need, but who took advantage of the moratorium and took a rent holiday. These are people who didn't lose their jobs, didn't have a reduction in income, who otherwise could pay their rent, but decided not to because they knew their landlord simply couldn't evict them. But when the opposite is true, when you know that there is a legitimate need and you've got an otherwise good tenant, yes, you can use wisdom in conjunction with understanding to make a way for a tenant that you know you want to keep anyway. Is it true that eventually you will have to raise the rent? Absolutely. Does it make sense for you as a landlord to raise your rents to the market level? Absolutely. But can you do it in a way that keeps a good tenant over a long term? Certainly. Is that going to look the same for everybody? No, it's not. And this is where you, as a landlord, are going to use your own understanding of the market and your understanding of your actual tenant to make a good business decision. You are operating in a way that makes fair market sense when you take your tenants into consideration and you make a mindful approach toward the issue of rent. From time to time, you're going to have to make a business decision to raise your rent. When you take into consideration the absolute reality of the market and the absolute reality of your tenants, I'm sure that you will make a sound decision. For learning more about landlording, you can check out all the other videos that we have on this channel. YouTube seems to think that this particular video is perfect for you, but until next time, landlords, happy leasing.